Hey, what's going on, guys? So our lesson 5 is ready, and thank you so much for following through. And I'm excited to let you know that um, today we are going to learn about controllers and routes. And this lesson continues where lesson 4 left off. So if you didn't follow lesson 4 and you'd love to, it's actually still here. And in lesson 4, we are just looking at Eloquent ORM, which is Laravel's implementation for interfacing with the database. So if you'd like to follow that, you're welcome to do so. But in this lesson, we want to look at controllers. So I don't know if you remember this bit of code here. So we have a route, the route facade, and then we call the get method, and then we pass in the URI, and then a closure, right? And the more official definition of a closure will be it's just an anonymous function that can access variables imported from the outside scope without using any global variables. So I'm not going to really go much into that, but I provided a link in the description so that you can learn more about anonymous functions and closures. But for now, we just want to focus on controllers, right? So more officially, controllers are just classes actually. Classes that contain logic for handling related requests, right? So they are housed in the app HTTP controllers directory in your project. So if you go to your project and you check app HTTP controllers, this is where your controllers are going to be housed. And if you check here, we already have a base controller. So if you wish, you can always extend this base controller so that it can give you access to other methods that come default with Laravel by default, so that you can use them like to do validation and something like that, right? But it's not a must that you extend the base controller, but you can always do that if you want, right? So if you like to create a new controller in your project, there are several ways, right? So first of all, you can just call the PHP artisan make controller and then the name of the controller. Let's see what this does, okay? So for example, if I were to use that, so it has created a controller here, and the controller, as you can see, is just an empty boilerplate that already extends the base controller, like I said, right? So this is very useful if you plan on writing custom functions that are not maybe CRUD functions. So that is just one of the ways to create a controller. Another way to create a controller is you pass the resource option. So what this does, as we shall see, let me just run that. So what this does is it creates the controller, and then it defines, as you can see the difference here, it defines a bunch of methods that are going to help you to with your CRUD operations, right? For example, the index method here, this one is used to return a listing of resources, all right? And the create method is for displaying a form for creating resources, right? The store method is responsible for storing data in the database, fresh data. And the show method is for loading, displaying one resource, okay? And the edit method is for editing, for displaying the form for editing. And then the update method is actually doing the actual updating to the database. And the destroy method is for removing a resource from the database, okay? This is awesome. And we actually have another third method where you can specify, you can actually specify the model that you like to be bound through to the routes. So Laravel has something interesting called a route model binding. So what that does is, so before we even talk about that, as you can see here, like for example, the show method, you only get the ID from the route. And then with that ID, you now look for the resource yourself in the database. So Laravel has something called route model binding. So what happens is, for example, let me just use the other method so we can see this more clearly. So if we were to, let's say, specify the category, for example, we want to create categories, but we want to also specify the model. So this model is going to be used for route model binding. So as you can see the difference now, instead of having the ID here, like this, we now have a type hinted object, right? So it's going to use the ID that is supplied by the routes to load this category from the database. If it's not found, it's going to return a model not found error, which is an equivalent of, which is a database equivalent of the 404. Okay, so this is more efficient, as in you don't have to take the ID from here and start loading for looking for the resource in the database yourself, but Laravel automatically resolve the thing for you. So this is very efficient, unless you want to do some extra filtering before you do anything else. This is always sufficient in most use cases, right? So for us, we are going to use this in the meantime. And as time progresses, we'll be able to learn more ways of doing this, and you'll be able to see the difference, why it matters to make the difference. For example, if this method fails to get the category, fails to find the category, for example, if you specify an ID of a resource that does not exist in the database, it's going to return a model not found error. But if you'd like it to return something else, for example, if you're using an API and you'd like to return a more graceful answer to the user, you could just use the ID, grab the ID like this, and use that to load to try to find if the resource exists. If it doesn't, and then return something else. Okay, so cool, that's awesome. So I'll leave it at that. Let's say we wanted to have one categories controller for a non-resource categories controller for the front end, for the front office, for displaying the content to the users. We can do that, right? So that we just have an empty boilerplate here, and we'll define several methods that we want to load our data. But then we need another one for the dashboard. Okay, we need another categories controller for the dashboard, where the user can, where the admin can log in and add new categories and manage the content, right? So what you do, you just do you can add an extra directory by specifying it like that. So you add, if you want several directories, you can also just add another one here, okay, and another as you wish. Okay, so you can specify in one line what how many levels you want the controller to be nested by adding a slash before, adding the name of the directory, and then a slash, and then the controller. So the last name the last part of your name is going to be used as the name of the controller, but then the rest of the names here before, so they are going to be split by the slash, and then the rest are going to be used as the name of the directories, right? So for example, if I do this, you're going to find that it has created this for managing the backend, all right, managing the back office. So you can see we successfully created two methods. So the difference comes in with namespacing. That's the cool thing about object-oriented programming. So you can see this is namespaced in dashboard, and this other one in controllers, all right? So this has an extra layer, and so this helps us to use the same class name for different things without raising any conflict. Okay, so you just make sure that when you're importing in your routes, you're going to use the right namespace so that you are able to access the right resource, right? So I'll leave it at that for now. And just to illustrate more, for example, if you wanted it to have 3 levels, you can also add another thing, another level here, and you do that. And as you can, if you check, you will find that it has created another top level directory, and if you check, it's also namespaced differently from the others. So they never conflict, yet they have the same name, and you can use them to serve different purposes. Okay, so that's cool. You can do that for the rest of them. So I wanted another one for post. So the model is always singular, and the controller is good to make it plural. It doesn't really matter what you want to do with it, but I always prefer to make it plural for the controllers, and for the model singular, right? Cool. So that's awesome for now. So you can see we have the rest of the controllers here. So we shall be using these controllers to create content, right? And we shall for the front-facing controllers, for displaying content to users, we shall need only for post. We actually don't need the resource one. We just create an empty boilerplate, right? So we can call it posts or even blog, because on the front end, it's going to be managed by the blogging system. So we do that. I mean, on the front-facing part. So both the dashboard and the main website are front end. So yeah, the back end is actually the code that we're writing here. Cool. So we have blog controller and categories controller. If you check, it's empty. This one is empty too. So we shall be using this to display content to users, and these other ones for the admin to add new content to the system. Okay, so we shall do all these things if you continue following the lessons. So that's cool. The next thing we are going to look at is middleware. So middleware help us to filter HTTP requests that enter our application. For instance, you may use middleware to restrict access to the to certain content to only logged in users, right? So there are several ways that we can include middlewares in Laravel, and by default, Laravel ships with several middleware that can help us to manage our content. So well, unless it's very necessary, you will rarely ever need to write your own middleware. Most of them, the ones that are shipped with Laravel are already just more than enough. So there are 2 ways of assigning middleware to a controller. So the first one is by assigning it to a controller's route in the route file. And the second one is specifying it within your controller's constructor. So let's see. For example, let me copy this route. This is just an illustration. Don't worry if you haven't looked at routes yet. So if I had this, let me just write it so that you can also learn. So we can have dashboard / for example, categories, and then so this is where the namespacing comes in. So for example, we wanted to do categories controller, then so we want the one that points to the dashboard, so that's the one we pick here, and then we do that. Cool. So actually we need to specify the controller in an array. So the controller and then the method. So for example, if we wanted to do the index page to show a list of categories, so we use the index method. We define the method. So this actually is the name of the method that is going to be used. So we shall see more about routes, but this is just for helping us to be able to illustrate middleware. So after doing this, if you want to add middleware to this, for example, if you wanted only authenticated users to be able to access this, you just add the middleware method, and then you define a method. For example, the middleware for determining if people are authenticated is the auth middleware. Yeah, so you could do that, and then everyone who tries to access this URL, if they are not logged in, they are going to be redirected to the login page, and then they log in, and then they'll be allowed to access this request. So you can see it intercepts the request, and then does some filtering, and then redirects the user appropriately. Okay, so that's the cool thing about Laravel. Another way of doing this, instead of having this, we can actually call this in our controllers constructor. So the controller for dashboard is here, so we can actually define here a controller, a method for the construct method. So we define our constructor here, right? And then inside here, define our middleware here. So for example, we want auth, and we want another, for example, we also have, like, if you wanted, if it was an API, you'd use auth and then API, or auth sanctum or something. I don't know, the new Laravel thing. Yeah, so don't worry if you don't know the names of this middleware. Actually, you can find them somewhere in the kernel. So these are the ones. So you can use auth.basic, cache headers, whatever. So mostly you're going to be using either verified and auth and password confirm. So mostly you're going to use those. You'll hardly need all these other ones. These are used by Laravel in other places, but in case you ever need them, you can always just use them. There's no actual problem. So for example, if you wanted the user to be logged in and also his email be verified, you can use also the verified middleware. So just like this, instead of doing it in the route like this, you can also do it in the controller like this, in the controllers constructor. So those are the two ways of including middleware in your controllers, right? Cool. Right. So assigning middleware to in a controllers constructor, like we saw, I just shown you, it can either accept a string with the name of the if you're using one. So if you're using one, you can just say, if you're using one middleware, you can just say what's the name of the middleware? Auth. But if you want several, you can also use an array. You pass an array with the list of your middleware, right? So cool. So the middleware method also provides you with extra filtering. So for example, if you'd like, so this middleware are going to apply to all the methods inside here, inside this controller. So if somebody is not logged in and is not verified, they will not be able to access this method. So if, like, you're returning a view, that person will not be able to see that page, right? They'll be redirected to the specific pages for handling this, right? Cool. So however, you can, like we see here, you can actually restrict it so that it only applies to one. For example, if you wanted it to work only on the index method, you would append it with the only method, and then you specify the name of the method for index. So the rest of the methods will not be restricted by this middleware. Only the index method is going to be restricted. So what you pass here is going to be the name of the method inside your controller. Okay, so yeah, cool. So you can actually do several. You can add another one here, and let's say create and whatever as you continue. Cool. Nice. So the other one is so except instead of writing so many methods here. For example, if you wanted to write to restrict access to all except the index method, instead of writing the rest of them, listing the rest of them, the create, store, show, edit, and destroy, inside here you could also just do except index. All right, so only the index method will be exempted, but the rest will be restricted by the middleware. Okay, cool. So that's fine. That's awesome. So for now, just leave it at that. For now, for me, I prefer to use the routes, because that way you can restrict a group of controllers in one line without specifying in every controller. And yeah, good. Right. So yeah, so like as an example here, for example, you could do something like this. Let me just show you. If I go back to a dashboard controller, I could define a method like that. So let's say I wanted to check if a user has selected a specific language. So I can pass in a closure. So this closure will give us access to the request and the next method. And so we are going to check if the request contains the language specified. For example, Espanol. It's going to redirect the user to the Espanol page, right? Otherwise, it's going to allow the user to proceed with the request. Okay. So this is just one application of middleware. Actually, you can use a closure in case you don't want to write an entire middleware to perform something. You can also just use a closure like this, and you have access to the request and the next method. And this next method, you pass in the request, and then it Laravel continues with processing. Okay. Otherwise, you can also redirect. You can intercept it and redirect in case it matches the criteria that you would love it to match. Okay, cool. So you don't need to worry so much. This is just an overview, and you barely need to do complicated stuff like this. But by the time you need to do so, you'll be aware. You'll be in a good position to make such decisions. Okay, cool. So actually, in order to prevent this lesson from being too long, I'm going to split it into two. So in the next lesson, you're going to look at routing. Thank you so much. See you in the next lesson.